Hello, PhotoPiller, Rafael the Bar here. As you know, exposure is the amount of light that reaches the sensor of your camera to create an image. By dominating the exposure, by dominating the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor, you'll have the creative control of what appears illuminated and what doesn't in your photos. So you create images that tell the story you want to tell. So the question is, how can you control the exposure of your photographs? Well, you'll find the answer in the exposure triangle. To understand the exposure triangle, to understand how to control the exposure, let's visualize the journey that light makes to reach the sensor. When light goes into the lens, it goes through the diaphragm, which allows more light or less light to go through depending on the aperture you've selected. If you open the aperture, you'll increase the exposure of your photos. And if you close the aperture, you'll decrease the exposure. The photo will be darker. So the aperture is the first setting that allows you to control the exposure. It is the first element of the exposure triangle. Then light reaches the shutter. The shutter is a kind of curtain that allows light to reach the center when it's open or prevents it when it's closed. The period of time during which the shutter is open, it's called the shutter speed or the exposure time. The more time the shutter is open, the slower the shutter speed. The more light the sensor will collect and the brighter the image will be. The faster the shutter speed, the less light will be collected. So the shutter speed is the second setting you can use to control the amount of light that reaches the sensor. It's the second element of the exposure triangle. Finally, when light goes through the shutter, it reaches the sensor. The sensor is the place where the image is created inside the camera. It's made of photosites and semiconductors sensitive to light. So what's the third element of the exposure triangle? Well, the third element is the sensitivity of the sensor, also called the ISO. The sensor has the ability to digitally amplify the signal captured, giving you the impression that it captures more light, but it doesn't. The higher the ISO, the higher the sensitivity, the brighter the image will be. And the lower the ISO, the darker it will be. To sum up, the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO form the well-known exposure triangle. They give you the control over the exposure of your photographs, which is great. But be aware of this. The decisions you make when setting these three parameters will not only affect the exposure of your photographs, they'll produce other consequences you must be aware of. Consequences that can completely change the final photo you get. So, to help you take into account all these consequences in the process of creating an image, please let me present you what we call the advanced exposure triangle. Obviously, photography is not only about getting the exposure right. It's not only about setting the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO that give you the correct exposure. There are multiple combinations of these settings that can give you the same exposure, but produce different images. For example, all these combinations produce the same exposure, but again, different images. It's what is called the reciprocity law, which I'll explain in a future video. If you wish to apply the reciprocity law, you can use the PhotoPills exposure calculator to work out the equivalent settings, all the combination of settings that can give you the same exposure. Play with it, it's so useful to understand the exposure triangle. And also in a more advanced level, the exposure calculator PhotoPills is super useful to calculate the equivalent exposure time when you're shooting with an ND filter in front of the lens. By the way, here you have a video where I explain how you can use the exposure calculator PhotoPills when you're shooting long exposures with ND filters. Check it out. Well, as I said, photography is not about getting the exposure right. Not only getting the exposure right, it's about getting a photo that can communicate the message you want. And that includes composition, exposure, and other factors I'll explain in a second. On the one hand, when setting the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, you need to take into account the effects that these parameters introduce or produce in the final photo. For example, the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field will be. The less areas of your photo will be in focus. And the smaller the aperture, the more depth of field you'll get. The more areas of your photo will be sharp, will be in focus. So wide apertures allow you to shoot shallow depth of field, allowing you to focus, to center the viewer's attention at one spot in the scene. And the small apertures produce more depth of field, which allows you to show, for example, the beauty of a whole scene, a whole landscape. Depth of field is a key creative tool you have at your service. You must master it, and if you want to master it, watch this video. On the other hand, the shutter speed allows you to show motion or to freeze motion. A fast shutter speed will freeze motion, and a slow shutter speed will show motion. If you wish to freeze motion, press pause on YouTube. Please pause now, because here you have a long list of suggested shutter speeds depending on different situations, depending on what you want to photograph. Take your time to take notes. Finally, once you decided the aperture and the shutter speed that produces the effect you want in the photo, the more depth of field or the less depth of field, freeze motion or show motion, then set the ISO to get the exposure right, to balance the exposure. But be aware that when pushing the ISO up, the sensor will digitally amplify the signal of light captured. This allows you to capture images that wouldn't be possible otherwise, like for example when photographing the Milky Way or star trails. But high ISO also produces noise, grain in the photo, because the sensor is artificially amplifying the information captured. It doesn't capture more information, it only amplifies it. So the higher the ISO, the more noise you'll get in the photo. And the lower the ISO, the less noise you'll get. So to sum up, in most situations when taking a photo, I first recommend you to set the aperture and the shutter speed that give you the effect you want, and then use the ISO to balance the exposure, to get the exposure right. But always keep an eye at the noise produced. Now, if we add the effects produced by the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO to the exposure triangle, we get what we call the advanced exposure triangle. I love this exposure triangle because it tells us the settings we can use to control exposure and also the other effects they produce in the final photo, which is key. If you understand how this triangle works, if you master it, you'll see a big change in your photography, because it gives you the power to decide the settings you need for the photo you want to take. Truth is that mastering the exposure triangle is just one step more in our long journey to control exposure. There are other cool concepts we need to learn, like for example the stop, the reciprocity law, the EV, the exposure value, and more. Concepts, terms I'll explain in future videos, I promise. But if you don't wish to wait, if you wish to learn and master the exposure once and for all today, make sure to download our super detailed and super long and super complete exposure guide. I'm going to leave a link to the guide in the description of this video and also in the first comment below. It contains more than 400 pages on exposure. And if you like this video, give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next Wednesday in another video. And remember that you have the power to imagine, plan, and shoot legendary photos. Bye.